Hello and welcome back to another Rush Duel Links video. Today we thought we'd do a bit of a tier list update, and this is for a couple of reasons. First off, it's been about 3 weeks since we did our last tier list, as well as the fact we have had a brand new box, being a deck build box, but a box is still a box, new cards are still new cards, and that is Scorching Flame Burst that did bring a couple new decks into the game. On top of that, we also had some skill rebalancing, with Servant of Dawn getting a bit of a buff, as well as Hell Tuning Invasion getting a bit of a nerf. All of this together has meant that we have basically a vastly different meta to what we had previously, and this tier list is now very much out of date. On top of that, we also have some leaks, which are very much hinting at what's going to be coming out soon. So what we thought we'd do, just for a bit of fun afterwards, is work out where we predict those new decks are going to lie. But again, it's entirely speculative. We don't know what the entirety of the cards we're going to be getting. We don't know necessarily how all those cards are going to interact, so we'll have to wait and see how that works. But right now, in front of us, we have the tier list that we came up with last time, and I think overall this was pretty accurate. Basically, the way we build our tier list is that we take a look at the data. We initially just throw up everything as the data says it is. Basically, the decks that are winning the most are just going to be up at the top. The decks that are winning the least are going to be down at the bottom. And then afterwards, we do sprinkle in a little bit of our own biases, our own experience from the ladder, from watching tournaments, etc, etc. So basically, this list is going to be completely out of date, especially because this number one slot up here is Hell Tuning Invasion that did get a massive nerf, and basically has not been seeing any play at all since that change. So if we take a look over at our data, we can see that there have been 5 major tournaments. Now, once again, we'll talk about what this is. So basically, the only tournaments that you're going to see here are tournaments that had at least 16 players and were not a point battle. And to kind of go into why that is, I think 16 is somewhat of an arbitrary cutoff point, but I think 16 players is enough to kind of get at least some sort of good feel for what is in the meta. It should have just enough diversity and just enough players that it starts to feel a little bit competitive. And as for why not point battles, that is because point battles are a bit strange. Point battles, if they don't hit a certain amount of players, a lot of the time will have repeat matches just again and again and again. I think it's not necessarily the strongest players that are going to win a point battle. Point battles are still good, they're still fun, and they still are representative of good players and people that are able to finish games in a timely manner and people that are able to consistently win games. I don't want to take that away from them, but it is hard to justify immediately putting something into this table based on point battles. As well as the fact we recently had a really cool point battle by the guys over at Rush Duel Links Discord server. But because of the way they run their event, the top 4 can then choose any deck they want to be locked in for their top 4 performance, and 2 of the players did bring Ride Across, and we don't really want to have Ride Across on this list when we feel like it doesn't really represent the current meta. That's just the reason it's not going to be here, but we did note that Thunder and Overlord were putting up good results during those point battles, so we are going to include them at the end. As well as the fact we also here have Duel Links Dynasty, which only had 14 players, and again, this is not going to be represented in this table, but you know, these 4 decks did well in a semi-big event, so again, these will come in at the end. But the main 5 events that we have, all of the results are here, going from 1st place, 2nd place, 3rd place, 4th place, etc, etc, etc. Then all of that information is collected in this table and then displayed in these pie charts. So we have our top 4 pie chart, and we can't really see a lot of it because my camera's in the way, but we do have the top 8 pie chart as well. So immediately, we could just look at this pie chart and be like, okay, this is it. We know exactly what's going to happen. We know exactly what decks are winning. We can see that 4 different decks have won tournaments, that being Royal Rebels, Death Doom Requiem, Harpies, Noodle Ninja, and Blasters Inferno. So, you know, maybe we just slap all of those into tier 1 and we're done. But naturally, that's not exactly how we're going to do this. So, first things first, Death Doom Requiem has won the most events, and it is putting up the best numbers. If we take a look at our data sheet, we can see that in the top 4 it has the most points, and top 8 also has the most points. It is the only deck to win 2 different 16+ player tournaments. It is almost undisputedly the best deck in the format right now. The second then would be the Harpies. Harpies is a very strong deck. It can be quite consistent, only having to rely on level 6 monsters, and having the ability to get over defense mode monsters is also really strong. Then it would be the Noodle Ninjas. Noodle Ninjas are kind of a awkward deck that has a lot of weaknesses, but it also does have a lot of strength and has some very dominant matchups. Then it would be the Overlord, even though this deck has not actually won a tournament yet. If we take a look at its top 8 and top 14 points and thus representation, it is seeing quite a lot. We've had 3 top 4 showings and a grand total of 4 top 8 showings, making it the next best deck. Then after that, it would be the Dawn Dino, which we will be representing with our Super King Rex. So Servant of Dawn has a couple of different builds, but this is generally the most played one, which is the kind of pure Dino variant. There is also an aggro variant, which does play Dragius, and there is also kind of a hybrid version, which is Dinosaurs plus Dragius, but the majority of them are running the Super King Rex, so we'll be using that to represent it. And this is obviously a very strong deck. It does have quite high defense, which does let you play around Sword and Shield quite a lot. After that, things get a bit funny. So next up we have Inferno. So Blaster's Inferno is an interesting deck. I don't really rate this deck particularly high, and this deck did manage to win a tournament, but I will say there are a couple of caveats to that. I do think the player who piloted this deck piloted it very well. I think the deck build was also very, very strong. But I would say I think the strengths of the deck didn't necessarily shine through, or at least not specifically of the skill and the cards required for the skill. I think primarily this deck was carried by Twin Edge Dragon and Dragius and creative use of Speedy Performer to buff those monsters up. Overall, I think that this deck is still fine. It's not a bad deck. I don't want to just like completely slander it. But I think you could probably get the same results in an aggro list or in a Dragonic Resonance list. And it didn't have to specifically be Blaster's Inferno, but it's going to be in tier 2 for now. We might be changing it up a little bit later. And that's kind of it for decks that have won tournaments or gotten very, very close to winning tournaments. So there are only 3 more decks that have actually been topping in tournaments. The first being Dragonic Resonance. And again, very, very similar to the Blaster's Inferno deck. They both are obviously dragon-themed decks. They both have a theme around popping back row, and they can both play Dragius. So very, very similar. I think personally, I do prefer the Resonance list a little bit more, but again, it hasn't actually won any events. If we go back and take a look at our list, we can see that Resonance has top 4'd 1 time and top 8'd twice. So it's performed a little bit worse than Inferno, but it has seen twice as many top 8s than Inferno, as Inferno's only ever topped when it won a tournament. And then finally, we have our Cyberse, which again is always going to be the best worst deck. We will continuously keep calling it this because it's not really seeing any additional new stuff. It did get a couple of new cards, but I don't feel like most people are even playing those new cards in the build, but kind of still riding what it had before with the maximum Ragnarok skill. And then finally, the aggro deck. And aggro is still, it's aggro. It's all the best cards. It's basically Dragius does things, right? Dragius the deck. So aggro will probably always be really good unless it eventually gets power crept. As we can see, aggro was the last deck kind of showing representation, and it's even had more showings than the Cyberse list, but Cyberse has broken into top 4 one time. But I think we could competently move these two around. So according to the data, this is our tier list, right? These are the decks, kind of. Now you could move these around a little bit. I think you could like maybe move something up to tier 1, move something down to tier 2, etc, etc. But these are the top 9 decks, as these are the only 9 decks that we are seeing pops with. Now, obviously, aggro as well is a little bit all-encompassing. We've got this in here representing all the different flavors of aggro. There's zombie aggro, there's thunder aggro, but we're going to put them all under the same aggro banner. So that's basically it then, right? That's going to be the tier list. But now we want to kind of throw our own thoughts, feelings, and opinions in. So my first feeling is that I do not think that Noodle Ninjas should be in tier 1. So the reason I'm saying that is, first off, a lot of these Noodle Ninjas are me. So if we take a look at this Noodle Ninjas, if we start highlighting these, this is me, this is me, this is me, and this is me. So as we can see, I've had quite an impact on this deck, placing quite highly. But the main reason I think that Noodle Ninjas should be in tier 2 is because they do have a lot of weaknesses. The deck does lose quite hard to Shield and Sword, being that most of the boss monsters have 0 defense, which is not in a great spot to be, as well as the fact the deck can struggle to deal with set 3 pass. Now you can play things like Tribute to the Doomed, or you can play things like Thunder Gazelle, or Stop Defense, or Pierce if you're really desperate to try and get around that, but primarily the way that we deal with set 3 pass is that we're basically just using Extra Spice's bird effect to just chip away at our opponent. Now, In certain matchups where your opponent doesn't have the ability to get to your life points either, I think Noodle Ninjas has a fantastic matchup. I think specifically it has a fantastic matchup into the Death Doom Requiem deck, which is the #1 deck right now, which is why I think it is quite a strong contender, and I think it has a pretty decent matchup into a lot of the other decks here. I think realistically it can beat Harpy Ladies. In fact, I have beaten Harpy Ladies quite a lot with this deck. I think it can beat Magnum Overlord, but does require us to run specific trap cards to deal with it. I think it does quite easily defeat a Dragius-less version of Seal of Dawn, but the Dragius version does hurt quite a lot because, again, the Noodle Ninja deck likes to stall out and play a slow control game a lot of the time against specific decks, and if your opponent is just overwhelming aggro you, so anything with Dragius basically, that can cripple the Noodles quite badly. Which is why, again, we then have Dragius deck, and Dragius deck, which are all a little bit scary for the Noodles, which is why I can't really justify them being in tier 1. Speaking of the #1 deck, that being the Royal Rebels with the Death Doom Requiem skill, this deck is really, really powerful for a reason. First off, it has so many high attack monsters that can be a bit of a nightmare to deal with. But the main reason this deck is so strong is that it forces your opponent to play differently. You can't just go full aggro at your opponent with a bunch of face-up monsters and just kind of hope for the best, because your opponent can then use their skill, summon out 2 bodies, tribute them both off, summon out Death Doom. Death Doom's effect wipes your whole board and then burns you for a ton, and then they attack you directly with the rest of their cards, which is going to be at least a 2500, possibly with 2 other monsters as well. So it's very, very powerful, and if you are not playing around it correctly, which means basically playing a bunch of defense mode monsters and leaving monsters face down a lot against this deck, you will be playing into their hands and they will be able to destroy you on the crackback quite easily. So very, very, very strong deck, and only has a couple of bad matchups, but again, a similar problem to the Noodles, where this deck really, really does struggle to get through set 3 pass. And that is the problem that Rebels have had pretty much forever, even in the physical game. Hell Tuning Invasion did sort that problem out, but it tilted the scales a little bit too much in their favor, and now with Hell Tuning Invasion nerfed, once again Royal Rebels have their original weakness. Harpies is also a very strong deck. It's very, very cheap, as well as the fact it's quite consistent. Not having to rely on level 7 and 8 monsters does make it quite dangerous. You can quite easily summon out quite a large board. Your opponent also cannot stall against you because you always have the ability to change one of their face down monsters to face up attack position and just attack over it, which can be very, very strong. It also has some of the better trap cards in the game, that being Counter Pigeons, which, although a lot of decks can play around it, enough of them can't that it becomes still quite useful. This deck in general can put out giant numbers. Your opponent cannot stall against it. I think all in all, Harpies is quite a well-rounded deck and a really strong pick for this current meta. Then we have Overlord. Overlord is a bit of a weird one because I still feel the same about this deck that I felt about it from day one, which is a lot of the time it is a worse 7's Axel Road, but you can just pull the maximum out of nowhere and just kill your opponent. I feel like Overlord gets most of its wins just by cheesing out a max like off the top of the deck and then just killing your opponent with that. And when it's not doing that, the deck is rather underwhelming. Now, it still can win games without doing that, for sure. The Spellcaster package is still very, very strong. 7's Red Magician is still a heck of a card, and we can get through set boards using Torna, which is still always going to be a really, really good pick until, you know, we get a lot further on in the future. But just always having a way to be able to deal with giant monsters and having a way to deal with set monsters is always going to make this deck really, really good. But again, I'm never a big fan of a deck that a lot of the time just kind of cheeses wins. And because of that, if you just don't see the maximum, if you just are in a situation where the maximum just never shows up, I feel like the deck can be quite weak, which is why it's going to sit down in tier 2. Next up, we have our Servant of Dawn, which is primarily a dinosaur list. I think this deck feels very well rounded. The monsters in the deck generally have quite high defense, which means it can play around Shield and Sword quite well. As well as the fact that because the boss monster brings back another decent statted monster from the graveyard, the deck actually feels relatively consistent if you're not playing too many boss monsters. Now, the main issue this deck's always going to have is that we do have to hit that criteria of 5 normal monsters with 1500 or more defense, which means primarily we're always going to be using 4 of those level 6 monsters and then 3 Super King Rex, so that is already 8 boss monsters, which can be quite a lot. But this deck is quite good at building a relatively strong board. It's not easy to just kind of blow it out. I think the worst matchup for this deck is probably the Death Doom Requiem, and that's just because Death Doom Requiem wants you to build up a giant board so it can just destroy the whole thing, just raff the board and burn your opponent for a ton. Unfortunately, the dinosaurs really want to sit there and build a board, so they just kind of naturally clash with each other, and it feels like Royal Rebels is almost the natural counter to the dinos. Then we have Blaster's Inferno. I personally think that Blaster's Inferno should be dropped to a tier 3 deck, and realistically, I think I would drop this even lower than where it is. But it has won an event, and that means it has a certain level of prestige to it, and you have to respect the fact that the deck has won an event. Now again, I've already spoken a bit about this, but I do think a lot of that comes down to the player piloting the deck and the specific build that they used, but I think a lot of that build could be better put to use in some of these other decks down here. So I think I'm actually going to move this all the way down. We're going to keep it in tier 3, which is still respectable. Anything in the top 3 tiers is a good deck. I want to preface this a lot as well. A lot of people will say that if you're in tier 3, you're a bad deck. And that is so far from the truth. If you're a bad deck, I would put you in Rogue. Even a Rogue deck, though, can still win games. Tier 3 is still very, very good decks. These are still very, very strong, very, very capable, and very, very able to win a tournament. Next up, we have Dragonic Resonance. And Resonance is kind of back with a vengeance. It's starting to see a bit more play, and it does still do what the deck has always done. The main draws to the deck right now is that Slayer is free pops on back row, which is still pretty good. Obviously, you can still play all the same dragon cards, which are pretty strong. You can play Dragonic Pressure, which is a little bit awkward to use at the moment, but is still a very good way to just wipe your opponent's board, and you still can do the old combo of getting like 4,800 damage in by wiping the board, then using some sports dragons to set up some monsters, tribute them off, summon, use the skill, gain a load of attack. Being able to boost multiple monsters is also really, really good. And because this card increases levels, we can also raise our levels to a point where a lot of the back row just will not be able to affect them, because a lot of the trap cards in this game specifically say they affect level 8 and lower monsters. So all looking really good. The main problems that this deck has is, one, its inability to play anything other than dragons does mean it is a little bit rigid in its deck building, and it means that we don't get access to some of the other tools that other decks can have, as well as the fact that, again, Slayer has 0 defense. And now that is quite a common problem. A lot of the monsters have 0 defense here. For example, the Royal Rebels primarily have 0 defense. The Harpies all have 0 defense. The Noodle Ninjas have 0 defense. The Magnum Overlord itself has 0 defense. The Slayer has 0 defense. There's a lot of 0 defense going around, which means Shield and Sword is running a little bit rampant right now. And this is just another deck that can just kind of fall over to that in the wrong situation. Next up, we have Aggro. Aggro is, there's not very much to say, right? Aggro is aggro. It's Draggiest the deck. We summon just all the good stuff, and then we put our own different flavor on it. We can have the zombies if we want overwhelming attack and a little bit of burn. We can have the thunder if we just want the piercing option and a little bit of a boost, as well as the consistency from the duck bill. So again, there's not really a lot to say about this. Draggiest is still really good. It still has some really good matchups into a lot of the decks on here. I would say, arguably, it doesn't have a great matchup in a Harpies because it doesn't really have a good way to play around the Harpy trap cards. It's going to have an okay matchup into the Rebels, but again, Rebels can just pop your whole board, so if you do summon a massive board, it can all just get destroyed. I think it does have a really, really good matchup into Noodles, so that's always going to be something that's got going for it. But overall, it's a bit of a boring deck because it is just good stuff for deck. And then finally on the list, we have the Cyburst deck. Cyburst is the best worst deck. This deck is always going to have the problem of it doesn't deal with face down monsters very well, which is a similar problem to a lot of the other decks on this list. But the only way we can actually deal with those set monsters and get damage in is by summoning out our maximum itself. So a lot of the time it does feel like get the max or don't do anything. This deck is very competent at summoning out multiple boss monsters, which is pretty good. It's also pretty good at clearing pretty much any board because we can weaken any of our opponent's monsters by 800 attack, which is pretty good. All in all, it's a fine deck. It just doesn't do anything unfair. It doesn't do anything particularly impressive that other decks don't do, maybe a little bit better. So next up, we're going to go and take a look at our high potential list. So Hell Tuning Invasion. I still think, even with the nerfs, this deck potentially could do something. And that's just because being able to change your opponent's face down monsters face up still can be very, very strong. I think Thunder is definitely a deck that is a little bit underrepresented at the moment. I think for the most part, people just aren't playing this deck rather than it's suddenly fallen off or it's suddenly bad. I still think Thunder is quite a strong deck. It's still quite consistent. It's just we're not seeing it being played. And I feel something similar with the 7's Axel Road. 7's Axel Road was a tier 1 deck. It didn't receive any changes. It's just fallen out of popularity. And I think a big reason for that is that it had a very, very strong matchup into the Hell Tuning Invasion because Hell Tuning Evasion generally doesn't end on a particularly big board. Seven's Road doesn't mind losing their whole board, so you'll just summon it out, attack through your opponent's quite middling board, let your board get destroyed, and then kill them again on the second push. Without Hell Tuning Evasion being so prevalent, I think this deck has fallen down a little bit, but I still think it's quite good. Then there's Ancient Forces. Again, we did see this come back into the light a little bit, but its tops were few and far between, but there is potentially still something there. It's just, again, nobody's playing it. Then there is the Light Machines. Again, I think this deck is still fine. I don't think it's suddenly, like, completely terrible. I think it is not as strong as any of the decks on here, but, you know, that's why it's in potential, because there is some potential. Then there is the Aqua deck, which, again, we did see one player, Shelmy, bring in this deck a lot and was kept putting up consistently good results, but since they stopped playing it, again, now this deck is just underrepresented. I think this deck potentially could still do something. I'm just not convinced it's going to be doing anything big or anytime soon. Then we have the Warriors. Again, Warriors is another list that's a bit weird. It's basically a battle trap deck, and we're in a meta right now where we have so many skills and so many cards that can boost their attack to ridiculous numbers that a small reduction of 400 isn't really going to do a lot against a lot of these decks. So I think unless we see something change there, Warriors are probably still going to feel a little bit lackluster. And then we get to our last new deck, I suppose, and that is the Semi-Ruler. This deck is rogue. This deck is garbage. I have really tried to make this deck do something, but it is just flat out bad. We haven't seen pretty much anyone take this into a tournament. It's not very good. I don't expect it to ever be good. The skill needs a massive buff, and it needs to be less restrictive. And even then, I still don't even know if it'll actually be good. Finally, I kind of want to talk about the Dark Magician. Dark Magician is going to be at the bottom of high potential, and I think this would even be in its own little section just called potential, not even high potential. I think Dark Magician is still quite bad, but there is something to be said for the new Shock Dragon we did get. Dark Magician is able to competently get 2,500 boards out quite easily through the use of the Magician Shuffle and Dark Magician Girl, which means we can use Shock Dragon to weaken our opponent's monster, potentially more than one monster, by 2,500 attack, which is like getting a bunch of direct attacks in. Now, is that necessarily going to be good? Probably not, but there is maybe something there. I haven't tested it at all. I have played against it a few times, and it seems okay, but that's going to be that for that. So this is our list, I think, right now. This feels right to me. These two definitely feel like the strongest decks in the game. I think, arguably, Noodles could be up here, but again, I feel like I'm doing a lot of the heavy lifting for this deck, as well as it still does have a lot of weaknesses, so I would feel bad putting it any higher. I think, again, we could basically have all 5 of these decks in tier 1, but I think realistically these two feel more consistent, they feel more powerful, and they have technically been putting up the best results, so it does make sense to have them both on their own in tier 1. Tier 2 also I'm quite happy with. I think these are 3 fantastic decks. I think realistically any of these decks could take games off any of the others in quite a consistent fashion. I think no one particularly has the dominance or the monopoly in any of these matchups. And then tier 3 is basically all the draggiest tier. I mean, who doesn't love the draggiest tier and the honorary dragon tier in Yugioh? High potential, we're feeling pretty good about all of this as well. I think realistically, Thunder could jump up into tier 3. I don't think it necessarily needs to. I think it's probably fine just staying in high potential because, again, we haven't actually seen it all that much. I think realistically, I would put Thunder in tier 3, and I think I would put it somewhere in here. I think somewhere in the middle of tier 3 does feel pretty good for it because, again, we did have some point battles, and in those point battles, Thunder was performing quite well. I don't think Thunder is necessarily like a tier 2 deck or a tier 1 deck, but it's definitely still very strong, and I think people do underestimate this deck quite a lot. I think the rest of this looks pretty much fine though. I don't think there's anything else that needs changing right now. And we do have Ride Across down here, which we were talking about a little bit before. We're going to put Ride Across down in Rogue, because why not? And that leaves us with just our 5 new decks, and these are decks that are not out yet. So we're going to predict where we think these are going to fall in the meta. Now, again, we don't know the entire card list of the cards we're getting, so it's going to be a little bit hard to decide. I would not be surprised, though, if Mirror Innovator was a tier 1 deck. The reason I say that is Mirror Innovator is a fantastic boss monster. You're able to use it to gain piercing, you can have it gain incredibly high attack, and you can shuffle cards from your graveyard back into your deck to be reused later, which helps with deck out and helps with reusing different types of effects. The Mirror Innovator is a fantastic boss, but we haven't got a new skill for it yet, and I would fully expect this card to be limit 3 when it does come out, which would mean we couldn't play Ace Breaker with it, which is a little bit awkward. Bearing in mind we don't know what other cards we're going to get, our boss monsters might be limited to just Mirror Innovator and then maybe Tough Striker, which would be a little bit awkward. So I don't know if I would put this in tier 1 or tier 2, but it's definitely going to be one of the two. Even without a skill, and even with very restricted boss monsters, I think this card is good enough on its own that it could be a tier 1 or a tier 2 deck. But now we're going to leave it in tier 1 because it feels right, but I would not be surprised at all if this ended up being tier 2 just because of the lack of skill and lack of support. Next up we have Arcan 3D. I really don't know about this one. I think the skill we're getting for it is a bit mid, to be honest. I don't really like the new skill. I also don't think the boss monster itself is particularly good. It lets you basically reuse one of your weaker monster's effects by putting it back in your hand, resummoning it, and because all rush effects are soft once per turn, we can use it again. It's going to really depend on the other cards we get, so I feel like putting it in high potential. I'm going to leave it somewhere around here. I think around here feels good. This could pop off, right? We could get some really, really strong support for this. We could get all of the Jam P cards and get all of the Candy support, and it would pop off and be fantastic. Psychics have a bad track record. I really want them to be good, but I'm not going to put all my eggs in one basket saying they're going to be fantastic. I think high potential is where they're going to stick for now. Then there's Ice Sark. I really don't know what to do with Ice Sark. I think Ice Sark is another one of those cards where it could be incredible depending on the support we get. I think the skill is a little bit awkward, and I think that's the main issue I have with it. The skill is not going to just suddenly make this really good, but it has the potential to do something. So I think I'm going to put Ice Sark down here as well. I think it could do something, but I don't think I would immediately rank it as a tier 2 or a tier 3 deck just yet. Then there's Metageus. I think Metageus, realistically, it could just slot in here. I think it's going to be another Geass Dragon deck. Obviously, it's not going to have the Dragius because Metageus is almost certainly limited 3, but multi-attacks are good, dragons are generally good. I think it belongs in the dragon tier with the other dragons and the honorary dragons, with that being our Dragos. And then finally, we have Blue Eyes White Dragon. Now, Blue Eyes White Dragon is a weird one. We don't know for 100% we're getting this card, but we do know we're getting Blue Eyes Bright Dragon. We're expecting this to be in some sort of structure deck. Blue Eyes Bright Dragon itself is from the modern version of the deck. It came out in a Blue Eyes structure deck that was released in the physical game. That deck was crazy at release and is still very strong to this day. I went 5-0 in a modern tournament with Blue Eyes White Dragon because that deck is crazy. The caveat to that is, that deck has a ton of brand new cards, is a fusion-based deck that works around spamming out Blue Eyes Ultimate Dragon, and does have Burst Stream of Destruction as its way to destroy your opponent's board and then get to their life points. I don't think we're necessarily going to get any of those things. Burst Stream of Destruction, I think, is maybe a little bit too strong to come to Rush at the moment. Now, it might still come out. We have seen some other board wipes, so there is potential that it does just come out. But without that card, it's going to have the same struggle of how do I get to my opponent's life points, as well as the fact that without a lot of the other modern support cards for this, I don't see it being super, super strong. So I think I would put it in tier 2. I think that's where I expect this to come out based on what I predict will be in the Blue Eye structure. I don't think they're going to give us any of the really, really, really strong cards. I think they're going to hold back a little bit, but they are going to want it to be somewhat playable. So I think it will be a strong tier 2 strategy, and it'll be more about just spamming out high-level dragons as much as you can. And I think that in itself could be pretty cool. And also seeing a fusionless Blue Eyes build is going to be something completely new. That is something we have not had in Rush Duel before, because basically as soon as we had a Blue Eyes deck, it was a fusion deck. So it's going to be pretty cool to see how that works. But this is the list. This is where we think the meta is now and our predictions for the future. And overall, I'm quite happy with this. So please let me know in the comments down below if you think this list was correct, if you think it was garbage, what you would change, and also where would you put the brand new decks that we haven't even got yet? Where would you predict those are going to be? I'd love to hear about it down in the comments. But thanks for watching the video, and I'll see you next time.